Om Prithvi Shantirantariksha Shantir Dyau Shantir Disha Shantiravantara Disha Shantiragni Shantir Vayu Shantiraditya Shantif Chandrama Shantir Nakshatrani Shantirapa Shantiroshadaya Shantir Vanaspataya Shantir Gau Shantiraja Shantirashva Shantir Purusha Shantir Brahma Shantir Brahmana Shantir Shantireva Shanti Shantir Me Astu Shantihi. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra Sukhina Santu, Sarve Santu Niramayaha, Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu, Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet, Sarvastaratu Durgani, Sarvo Bhadrani Pashyatu, Sarvas Sadbuddhimapnotu, Sarvas Sarvatra Nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. So last week we began with chapter 5 of the Gita, and we took a look at the first 5 verses. And we saw how Krishna again emphasizes that in order to be fit for the highest knowledge, first our heart must become pure. And the purification of heart occurs through doing work in a selfless way. What is sometimes called the Nishkama Karma Yoga, doing work as is yoga. And then the one verse that we discussed a lot last time was the verse 3, which said, "He who neither dislikes nor desires should be known as a perpetual renouncer of action." So it's possible for all of us to be always be that highest category of being free from the bondage of actions if we can live without dislikes or desires. The Sanskrit word here is na dveshti na kankshati. And then some of you might remember we had questions about this dislikes and desires. Now the dislikes here doesn't mean that we can have likes, but we shouldn't have dislikes, first of all. So the dislikes really negates both likes and dislikes. The word that is used here is dveshti. So to 2 words in Sanskrit which stand for likes and dislikes are raga and dvesha. So raga is likes, dvesha is hatred. So one who is free from both likes and dislikes and free from desires, such a person is a nitya sannyasi, is already a sannyasi. So one of the questions that came up was about living without desires or minimizing the desires is understandable. But what's the point about not having dislikes? Because having likes and dislikes seems so natural, so inbuilt within us. Now the likes and dislikes that we have are really the seeds, the samskaras, the mental impressions. There are certain mental impressions already lodged within our minds, because of which certain things, certain people, certain places, certain ideas we instantly like, or we see them in a favorable way. And there are certain people, places, things, ideas we have an instant dislike for. Is it natural? Well, considering that almost everyone has it, we have got to say it's natural. Is it something that's unavoidable? To a point. Is it something that we are stuck with all through our life? Probably not. So let's think a little bit more about this likes and dislikes. What is it that makes me like something? Or what is it that makes me dislike something? And it's almost always our prior experience with that thing. Most often that experience is sometime in this life itself. But oftentimes we might think that, well, I don't recollect any specific reason or instance why I like something or why I dislike something. When we are not able to recollect any specific reason why we like or dislike something, what in Vedanta they say, well, then maybe that impression about liking or disliking has been there in my mind, maybe I've carried over from my earlier birth. So, and then the example that I often give is that suppose someone likes chocolate ice cream. Then we say, why do I like it? Well, it obviously means at some point earlier I have eaten chocolate ice cream and it has made me happy. Because it makes me happy, I like it. And there is let's say there is some people or some person, you just want to keep away from them, just total dislike. And the reason could be, well, maybe at some earlier occasion, they have brought me some pain, some amount of suffering, which is why I don't want to have anything to do with it. So that's what likes or dislikes do. Normally, both of them, since they are the mental impressions, they lead eventually to some action. And almost always, that which we like, we look upon it favorably, and not just look upon it favorably, we want to either possess it or be as near it as possible, generally. And that which we dislike also leads to action. We want to run away from it or keep it away from us. So both likes and dislikes will lead to action. Now, action will lead to the result of action, karma phala, and that's how it will bind us. So in that sense, likes and dislikes and desire are not completely two independent things, although it's kind of put here this way, one who neither dislikes nor desires, but what it really means is the two are interconnected. Both likes and dislikes lead to desire. A desire to have what we like and a desire to keep away from what we dislike. And so a person who is free from this is already a sannyasi. That's what this verse says. So what do you think about what I have said so far? Does it make sense? Some of you who had question about this likes or dislikes last time, do you think some of it has been answered with this? Is that okay? If you have any further questions about likes or dislikes, feel free to ask. Yeah.
So Swamiji, so for instance, like eating food, which is required for survival, would that be considered a like, because you like food, but it's kind of linked to our survival? Is that considered a like?
Well, I mean, not every food that you eat you like, but you eat it anyway, right? So, if you liking itself is nothing, it's not a crime. All that it says is, if you eat something because you like it, then obviously it brings you joy. If at some point that which you like is taken away from you, is not made available to you, or it's difficult to get, then it's going to be painful. That's all it is. So the more you are neutral to it, now that again doesn't prevent you from being happy. The food that you naturally enjoy eating, if it comes to you, you eat it, you are going to be happy anyway. But if you like, oh, I like it, I want it, that kind of active expression of like and dislike, we are setting ourselves up for some pain. That's the only idea. I mean, in one sense you could say, well, when we say, I like my spiritual practice, well, is that also kind of like or dislike? In a way, yes. And in some sense, liking your spiritual practice is not a bad idea. Why I say not a bad idea is that, for instance, some days you miss your meditation. Now, if you literally enjoy doing it, like it, then you're going to miss it. You're going to feel bad about it. And I think that's a good thing. It's a good thing to feel bad about missing your meditation. It's a good thing to feel the pain that I have not been able to think of God. I think that pain is actually good. So I think that like is good. So again, whenever you read this likes and dislikes, you just have to kind of put it in the context. If my love for spiritual practice is going to take me away from all my hurdles and obstacles in spiritual life, then that kind of thing is good. The more, I mean, you might say, well, you shouldn't have any attachments. True. But if my attachment to God, if my attachment to spiritual life is going to help me detach myself from the things which actually make me weaker or bind me more to the material world, then this attachment is good. So in other words, we don't have anything personal against attachments or desire or anything. We just, as spiritual seekers, we must do all we can to bring us, whatever brings us closer to the spirit, closer to the spiritual ideal. Is that okay? Okay. So let's now read verse number 6. Sanyasastu mahabaho dukkhamaptumayo gataha yoga yukto munir brahma nachirena gacchati. But renunciation of action, O mighty armed one, is difficult to attain without performance of selfless action. The sage devoted to selfless action attains Brahman quickly. So without doing work as yoga, if we give up work without attaining this, without really doing it as a form of yoga, then giving up is not possible. We might delude ourselves into thinking that, oh, my heart is pure, now I need to only just be immersed in Brahman. It's a kind of very fascinating thought when we can do it. But sometimes we might want to just give up work because we don't want to do it. And there is a story which is told that one day one young novice went to a teacher and said, could you please accept me as your student? And the teacher said, good. And this was in ancient times, so he just went and stayed in the teacher's hermitage. And in the morning, they got up and they both sat in meditation. And after a while, it was time to go to the woods and bring wood. You have to start cooking and all of that. So then the teacher tells the student, why don't you now, it's time to go and get some firewood so that it's time to cook. And there is a rule that if you use a rosary, if you japa mala for japa, then you shouldn't leave it halfway. You need to complete the entire round. And so when the teacher asked the student, could you please go and get some firewood? And the student says, oh teacher, I'm in the middle of my mala, so I can't get up. And so the teacher waited, and this student is still continuing. Afterwards, finally, the guru said, okay, it'll take time for him. So the guru went and got the firewood. And then he asked the student, now come on, it's time to cook. And then the student said, well, teacher, I'm in the middle of my mala. And so then the teacher then cut the vegetables and started cooking. And finally, again, the teacher afterwards said, now, student, get up, and now we need to set the plates and get ready for lunch. And then the student says, oh teacher, I'm just in the middle of my mala. And then finally, the teacher then set all the plates and served food. And then he said, now come on, it's time to eat. And then the student says, now, how often can I just keep on saying, no, I must obey my teacher. And then he just goes and sits and eats. So that's what is meant here. The renunciation of action is very difficult without performance of selfless action. So only when my heart becomes pure as a result of doing work as yoga, then I'm fit to give up work. Without that, if I try to give up, I'm only deceiving myself. Not only will it not purify my heart, it will in fact bind me more. But once a person is able to make his or her heart pure as a result of working selflessly, then such a person attains to Brahman quickly. Attaining to Brahman quickly simply means Brahman is not the name of a person, it's not a place. Brahman simply means the vast one, the infinite one. And attaining Brahman means we are able to shed our limited identity. Right now, our identity is limited to this psychophysical being. So we see ourselves as human beings, as living creatures whose existence is sandwiched between birth at one side and death at the other. And in between, we have all this jumble of joy and sorrow, victory and defeat, and so on, and all the positive and negative emotions that we go through. So to rise above this duality and be one with this infinite reality, then we are free from death, free from all pain, free from all sorrow. That is what is meant by attaining Brahman. Verse number 7. The question that can be raised here is, sure, as a result of working selflessly, I might attain Brahman, but what about the work that I do after I attain Brahman? Because we know that if once you attain Brahman, you don't just vaporize or evaporate immediately. I mean, otherwise there wouldn't be any enlightened people. As soon as you become Brahman, you disappear. It does that way. Doesn't happen. So we find that after enlightenment, the enlightened ones still continue to live, and if they live, they are doing work. At the very least, they are eating. They are eating. They are walking. They are talking, and in fact, they are doing a lot of work. Perhaps they do more work than we are able to do. If you see the lives of these great ones, Shankaracharya, such a short life, just 32 years. Within 32 years, the extent of work that he has done is phenomenal. I don't think we wouldn't be able to do it even if we lived to 80 or 90 years. Vivekananda lived for less than 40. But again, so these enlightened ones, they do a lot of work. So the idea is that as a result of selfless action, they have become enlightened. But won't the work that they do after enlightenment, would that work not bind them like it binds all of us? That is addressed in verse number 7. Yoga yukto vishuddhatma vijitatma jitendriyaha sarva bhutatma bhutatma kurvannapi na lipyate. He who is devoted to selfless action, yoga, and pure in mind, whose body and senses are under control, and whose self has become the self of all, is not touched, even though he may be performing work. What's interesting in this verse, if you follow the Sanskrit, the word Atma comes several places. You can see Vishuddhatma, Vijitatma, Sarva Bhutatma Bhutatma. Now the word Atma, oftentimes you will remember, we always say there is the body, there is the mind, there is the Atman. Now the Atman is a term we always use to refer to the spirit, the non-material part. But in Sanskrit, the Atma simply means the self. And we don't have to get caught up in the term Atma, because depending on the context, it can mean many different things. So Vishuddha Atma, Vishuddha Atma here really means pure in mind. So Atma here means the mind. Then the second Atma, Vijita Atma, the Atma which is under control, there the Atma means the body. And Sarva Bhutatma Bhutatma. So these two Atmas, they mean the spirit. So in this one verse, although the same word is used, Atma, in one place it means the mind, one place it means the body, one place it means the spirit. So the idea is this: he who is devoted to selfless action, one who is a karma yogi, as a result of which his or her mind has become pure, whose body and senses are under control, whose self has become the self of all, means a person who sees oneself in all and everyone in oneself. Such a person is not touched even though he may be performing work. Now that's the experience of the enlightened one. One who has become enlightened is completely pure in mind, whose body and senses are under control, everything is under control. So such a person is not touched by work. And you might remember, we said, what is it that connects us to the work that is done? It is the sense of I. So when the act of reading is occurring, for instance, I can say, here is the book, here are my eyes, and I can say, I am reading. But essentially, if you just look at it in an impersonal sort of way, then really the book, the hands are holding it, the eyes are reading it, the mind comes in the process about understanding mind and intellect, what's going on. So where does the I come in really? The hands are holding it, the eyes are reading it, the mind is processing it. All these things are doing their job, and I feel I am reading it. So this action occurs. What connects me to this action is because I feel I am doing it. But now, if I know that this body is only a covering, I'm not the body, and therefore, hands are holding it, but the hands are not me. So I'm not holding it. The eyes are seeing it and eyes are reading it. I'm not the eyes, I'm not reading it. The mind is processing it, I'm not the mind. And so we don't have to really keep on saying all this. What it really means is that once the more identified I am with the spirit within me, I'm able to see everything that is happening and yet not feel that I am doing it. Now that is the difference between an enlightened being and the rest of us. They do exactly what we do. They also eat, they talk, they move, they walk, everything that we do, they do. The only difference is when we walk, we feel I am walking. When we talk, I feel I am talking. And for them, it just happens by itself, without the sense of I. And that is why is not touched even though he may be performing work. In other words, the work that we do or we will do or we can do without the sense of I, we will not be touched by that work either. So the goal here is therefore to do the right thing, to do the good thing, but as far as possible, keep the ego out of it. It's only the ego ego is the source of both, not just pain really, in some sense. It brings us joy and it brings us sorrow. The trouble is, no one has problem with joy. Well, more the merrier. Only the problem with sorrow. So is there some way we can have only joy and no sorrow? That's not possible because they go together. But the goal is, if I can keep that's why we go back to that, beyond likes and dislikes, minimizing our desires, then we are able to let go of these petty joys and petty sorrows of daily life and experience a much deeper kind of joy. But that deeper kind of joy will not come unless and until I have let go of this ordinary kind of joy. Now, should I let go of the ordinary joy first and then the deeper joy will come? Or should I first make sure the deeper joy is there and let go of this ordinary joy later? I mean, it's like they say bird in hand is worth two in the bush. It's like I give up the joy that I have and nothing else comes. Then what? The truth is that unless and until we experience a little bit of that deeper joy, we won't be able to give up the smaller joys of life. That's just the way things are. And you will see in our own personal lives, when some kind of a glimpse into that deeper reality comes, and it oftentimes comes in most unexpected ways at unexpected times. But when something truly uplifting occurs, and it might be maybe just a fleeting second, but once you experience it, it strengthens our faith. It just then makes us realize that all of this is not just some kind of a theoretical talk, or just some kind of a matter of just believing in something, that there is really something out there. When that glimpse comes, then the letting go of these superficial joys and sorrows become much easier. And so you don't have to give up these smaller ones until something deeper one comes. So it really, renunciation or giving up, so long as my giving up is a very painful experience, it's not really easy. It's not even possible, really. See, giving up something, if it is painful, it also means it's still valuable to me. And no one wants to give up what is valuable. But on the other hand, if something makes you realize that it's not as valuable as I thought, then it's very easy to give up, right? It's like, let's say, well, let's say you have some souvenir, and you feel, oh, this is something very precious because it has come from this very special place, and you have treasured it long, and then someday you make a revelation comes to you, or some friend comes and says, you know what, this is actually fake. This is just, if you turn it back, it's written made in China. It's not really an original one. And then that which you have preserved for such a long time with such great this thing, it's like, oh my God, this is just a fake thing. And then someone brings you a real, genuine one, and you check from every side and say, yes, this is the real one. Then to give up what is fake is not painful at all. But before you knew it was a fake thing, and you wouldn't have parted with it so easily. Now that's the thing about our lives also. There are things which are valuable to us, and no amount of books or anyone telling you, oh, give it up, just not going to happen. But through deep introspection and through our own, sometimes they say like glimpses of immortality, or as intimations of immortality, or something like that. So, and these things will come. Every sincere seeker of truth, these things do come. And as I said, in often unexpected ways. It can, if you are sensitive to music, it can come through music, it can come through art, it can come through deep thinking. If you are a lover of nature, it can just come through maybe a beautiful sunrise or sunset. There is just no one way to know how it happens. But if there is a sincere longing for the truth in our heart, somehow, in some mysterious way, it will make its presence known to us. And when that happens, then things which were very valuable to us earlier, maybe they lose a little bit of their shine because we have found something even more valuable than that. And then letting go becomes much easier. So what is the experience of one who is enlightened, when that enlightened one does things? That is described in the next two verses, 8 and 9. Let's chant them. Naiva kinchit karomiti yukto manyeta tattvavit Pashyan shrunuvan sprishan jigran Ashnan gachan swapan shwasan Pralapan visrujan grunhan Unmishan nimishan napi Indriyani indriyartheshu Vartanta iti dharayan. The man of selfless action who knows the truth thinks, I am not doing anything, even while seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, eating, going, sleeping, breathing, speaking, excreting, grasping and opening and closing of the eyelids, believing that the senses rest in the sense objects. Really, these are quite a big list, but still not comprehensive enough. It really means everything, not just the things that are mentioned here. All activities, physical or mental, are included. So, an enlightened being, all of these things occur in the body and mind of an enlightened being. But the enlightened being feels, I'm not doing anything, believing the senses rest in the sense objects. So that's what I meant. Senses, the sight of seeing, rest in the sense object, the book, the mind, the object. So all the senses have their respective objects. So these senses are interacting with the objects. And for me to think I am reading, I am talking is ignorance. Knowledge would be, here is this capacity to talk, to make sound. You've got a nice voice box here, it's making sound, the mind is putting it into words, and it's just occurring. And can I be an observer? See, sometimes it is easy to be an observer of things that are happening around us. But still, even to the things that are happening around us, we are seldom neutral observers. Most of the time, we are observing whatever is happening around us through the lens of our own mind. And our mind is colored, no doubt about it. That's how we go back to the likes and dislikes. Our mind is colored by our own set of biases and prejudices, things that we like, things that we don't like. So when I see, I don't just see, I also judge, I also react. So if you see a carpet, if you only see a carpet, that would be great, but it's not. First of all, when we see, our mind also covers what we see with ideas. And then likes and dislikes. It's like I see the carpet and say, oh, this is red in color. Oh, it's a great design. Oh, it's beautiful. You know, all these thoughts are covering my pure neutral sense of perception. Sometimes it is said, for instance now, my eyes are closed, I'm not seeing anything. With the eyes, I'm still hearing sound, but assume that I'm not now, the world is cut out from me. Now when I open my eyes, for the first nanosecond, well, whatever the smallest time that you can think of, I'm just seeing nothing but God. But that's such a shortest time frame. Very soon, what I see is already covered by ideas. It's like, oh, it's evening, now it's a Gita class going on, and this is nice, this is good, this is bad, this is terrible, this is red. So the ideas about the color, the sound, and of course our likes, dislikes, everything comes and colors what we see. So we are not really seeing the world as it is. We are seeing the world through our lenses. And that's what really hides the reality. Now, if I can see, keeping all my prejudices and likes and dislikes away, without even thinking that I am seeing, then I'm just in the presence of God. And that is why that I very like that quote that which someone said, I forget who, that if you see a tree, if you look at a tree and you see a tree, you have not seen anything. If you look at a tree and see there a miracle of God, then alone you have seen. Now, if we can be truly neutral, without any likes or dislikes, without even the feeling that I am seeing, and here everything that you see will be a miracle. Everything that you see will be filled with the presence of the divine. Now that's what an enlightened being does. You see, oftentimes, say you are on the road and you are driving. Now you are going, you're following the speed limit, say 65 miles per hour. And oftentimes, even when we speak, or someone asks you, hey, what speed are you going? I'm going at 65 miles per hour, and that would be like a very truthful statement, but maybe not. Am I going, or is the car going? So really, it's the car who is running. I'm just sitting there. And yet, we just say, I'm going fast, or I'm going slow. But really, I'm just sitting. It's the car which is moving. Or we say, oh, I'm flying tonight. I'm not flying. I'm just going to go from here to the airport and sit in that car. It's the plane which is going to fly, right? I mean, although we say it, we can understand. Well, when I say I'm flying, really it's not me who is flying. It's actually the plane that is flying. Exactly in the same way. Exactly. No difference. Exactly in the same way. When you say, I'm reading, you are not reading anything. You are the Atman. You are just there. It's your eyes, it's your hands, it's these books, they are doing. So all activity is in things happening. The more we are able to remember this, the easier it will be to get our little I, our little ego out. And the more the ego gets out, the more the Lord gets in. What's preventing the divine from occupying? It's a little bit like this. For instance, now you have if you invite a guest, an honored guest to your home, and there's one special chair, and you say, please come and sit down. But someone is already sitting on the chair. Now, how can your honored guest sit on a chair which is already occupied, right? And we'll say, no, I can't sit. That person who's sitting there has to get up from there, right? Exactly in the same way. So all devotees of God say, oh Lord, Lord, in my heart, and we all say, I want to meditate on the divine, and please come. And all our prayers and meditation is really inviting, or be trying to feel and see the presence of the divine in our heart. But the problem is, the heart is already occupied by the ego. And so the Lord comes and says, no place to sit. So get the ego out. And so those moments when we are able to kind of push the ego out, then the Lord gets to sit for a little while. Most of the time the Lord is standing, the ego is sitting. So that's another one imagery for you to work on. So verse 10. Brahmanyadhaya karmani Sangam tyaktva karoti yaha Lipyate nasapapena Padma patra leaf in water, because lotus just grows in water. Without water, the lotus will die. So it is in the water, but it's untouched by the water. Exactly in the same way, we don't have to run away from the world, because we can't, first of all. No matter wherever you go, the world is still there. You may go on a mountaintop, you may go on a cave, but that's still a part of the world. You may go in the middle of a desert, you might be away from crowds, but that's still a part of the world. So none of us really can get out of the world. What we can do is not allow the world to occupy our heart. So the world is the right place to be in, but the world to be in the heart is not the right place for it to be. As a boat has to be in water. A boat which is on land is useless. A boat, that's the right place for a boat to be in. But the water, if the water comes and fills in the boat, then we call that boat Titanic, right? So we like a boat. We don't want the Titanic. So that's what is the given example here. If we perform our action, dedicating them to the Lord and giving up attachment, is not touched by sin. The word sin, the word in Sanskrit here is papa, and it's often translated as sin. And as I mentioned to you before, the sin, the term as the same term occurs in Judeo-Christian tradition, sin as an act of disobedience to God. That's not how it is understood in Vedantic theology. The word sin here is, well, it is a very theologically loaded term. But what is meant here, the Sanskrit word is papa. And what is really meant here is both good and bad karma. Not just bad karma. Well, it's like this. If you want to make a distinction, then the bad karma is often called papa. The good karma is called punya. And so punya and papa are good and bad karmas, and then they lead to happy or painful results. And when I spoken in context of a place, then we can speak about a heaven which will give you happy results, a hell which will give you painful results. But here, when the word simply the sin is mentioned, it's not in terms of just the bad works, bad actions. It means both good and bad actions. So, as we have seen, heaven as an ultimate ideal is rejected in Vedanta. Because what Vedanta says is that if it's possible to go to a place, then it's also possible to get out of it. So a place cannot be a place of permanent residence, because a place is still a part of this relative universe. And this relative world in which we all function is as three basic characteristics: time, space, and causality, cause and effect. So everything that answers to time, space, and causality is a part of this sensory world. And so heaven, understood as a place, is still occupying space, and therefore according to our reason, it doesn't stand to reason that it's somewhere you can go and stay permanently. And so both, if good karma takes me to a happy place and a bad karma takes me to a painful place, from a higher standpoint, both are equally binding. And the example that is given is a person who is tied with a rusted iron chain and someone who is tied with a shining gold chain. If you want to make a distinction, you can say, well, someone with a gold chain is better off than someone. But on the other hand, as far as the people themselves are concerned, they both are bound. So it's no consolation that, well, you're bound, but still it's a gold chain. So that's how in Vedanta they see heaven and hell. So I can be as much bound by my goodness as by my wickedness. So the solution, ultimate solution, the ultimate truth is beyond good and bad. So first we need to eliminate the evil from our thoughts, words, and actions. And when that good remains, then that good can be a burden at that point. That doesn't mean, no, people say, well, if you have to give up, why not give up right from the beginning? It doesn't work that way. First, we will not be able to transcend that which is bad. The bad has to be eliminated ruthlessly, no mercy. So we might say, oh, in spiritual life, we must be merciful, forgive everyone. No, don't forgive the evil in you. Just crush it, be merciless. If all your vengeance and desire for violence, use it on all the negative, weakening tendencies of the heart. Mercilessly just finish them off. Then you will remain with this good thing. When you remain only with the good thing, then that good thing is a burden. You say, well, what do I do with all this good now? When you remain with the good thing, it's possible to transcend it. When you transcend the good, then you reach that state which is much higher, much deeper, and everlasting, which is beyond this polarity of good and bad, which is beyond the polarity of pain and sorrow. It just goes high above all that. And that's the goal that Vedanta put. Where a place, a state, not a place, a state beyond limitation. A state which is really not a state. Even to call it a state is not philosophically right. It is something that cannot be put into words. The moment you put it into words, you've already limited it. The moment you put it into words, you've already kind of, So you cannot express the inexpressible. That's the idea. So here, when it says not touched by sin, means is not touched by any karma, good or bad, because all karma will lead to bondage. Verse 11. I think 11 we can do next time. So you have any thoughts or questions? Yeah.
Perhaps this is a silly question or some very foundational, but a bee, its universe is complete. It's not dualistic. When it opens its eyes, all it sees is divinity all the time because it cannot process things, right?
Who?
A bee, like an animal that doesn't have like a processing capability.
Oh, how do you know?
Because its brain cannot process information. I don't know.
You don't know. I mean, only a bee can say what bee is doing, right? I mean, that's true. I mean, because whatever explanation we give, it's still a human explanation. It's what we think the bee knows or doesn't know. And our thinking is based on, our brains function in a certain way. The bee doesn't have the corresponding thing, so bee probably cannot do it. Probably cannot, I don't know. But I'm saying definitively, you cannot say yes or no. Secondly, I don't think you can say that a bee cannot process anything at all. A bee definitely can process. A bee knows where the flower is. A bee knows which flower to go to. A bee knows where to go to and what to do. Yeah. So I think there is some processing going on there, right?
But it's instinctive. There's no I. It just knows.
Oh no, I think there is I. I think bee is probably too small for us to kind of get an idea, but animals have a sense of I. This actually in Shankaracharya's commentary it comes. If there is a buffalo or a cow, you give some grass and a cow will come running to take it. You run it with after a stick and the cow will run away. So if there is no sense of I, the cow wouldn't be able to process, oh, I'm in danger, let me run. Or, oh, this is something I love. They do, yeah.
So I guess my question is, first of all, why this disease of the ego or this?
The why is a very good question, but it's a question that cannot be answered so long as you are in it. And when you're out of it, the question doesn't arise. So that's the that's the thing. Why we can't say why, because we're already in it. It's not, and so as long as we are in it, there is no answer to it. So first of all, you get out of it. When you get out of it, then the question doesn't remain. Yeah, that's the predilection. Yeah, Kim?
Can I ask a question about a session?
Sure, yeah.
I was catching up on some of the podcasts, and you were talking about what Krishna, to lose our fear, detachment, and anger. And you were saying it seems very discerning to become enlightened. Why do we have to go through these trials to sort of to get there? And then Krishna says that we'll all be judged by the religion that we know or the way we worship God. Remember that?
No, just no, it doesn't matter. You just say what your question is. Yeah.
Well, so it said you were saying something about, or the verses were saying something about we will all be sort of, like held to the standard that we know, like the religion that we know, or the way we worship God would be how we're viewed by God, I guess, or it's not that path is the right path. So it's just troubling to me lately, to see so much kind of, violence in the world, and particularly like in places like the Middle East, where I think if you had dinner with some of these people, they probably seem like very nice people, feel they're acting from very good places, but in the name of God, wouldn't necessarily see them and think, oh, this is a bad person, but yet their way of worshiping and their way of acting in God's will is in a very harmful way. So it's just trying to, I don't know, find it troubling lately and just trying to make sense of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with the human mind. And that's why the Gita says that the mind can be our friend, the mind can be our enemy. That is, unless and until the mind is sufficiently clear and it's refined, it can be swayed either ways. Even things to one person what might seem like totally false or totally unreasonable or bad. So I'm looking at something and I'm thinking, this is bad, this is not right. And someone else is looking at the same thing and thinking like, oh, this is great, this is wonderful. It just means that my mind, based on my own understanding, right or wrong, or my own biases and prejudices, based on my own experiences, is processing it in one way. And someone else, based on their biases and prejudices, their information or misinformation, is processing it in another way. And that's the cause of a lot of conflict and fights in the world. Because in any conflict, those on both the sides, each of them is very justified, like, I'm doing it for a good cause. You see? Well, that's what makes the world, right? Vikram?
So Swamiji, when we were chanting one of the verses recently, I realized how poor my Sanskrit is. So I'm sitting there saying, oh, my mind knows Sanskrit poorly, but my lips are moving. So my question is, so at one level I want to observe that that's not me who's poorly chanting, it's my mind. But on the other side, I want to improve how I chant. So how do I reconcile both of those motivations?
No, don't reconcile. Do it with the ego. I want to improve. Let your ego remain. It's not a bad ego. I mean, ego itself, don't look upon ego like it's something terrible. You see, the sense of I itself is neutral. I mean that, yes, sure, at some point that I will have to be given up. But right now our problem is not, don't worry about giving up. Right now, let me use the I. It's not like we can give up anyway, even if we want to. So with the sense of I, let me make sure that the I does the right thing. The I does the good thing. That the I holds on to positive, healthy ideas, positive, healthy relationships, positive, healthy action. So don't worry about giving up the I right now. That we'll come to that. But right now, actually make your I good and strong and healthy. Because an unhealthy I will never be able to give up an unhealthy I. So first, it's like this. First, if you want to, when in any animal sacrifice or something, or even you first feed, not just doesn't have to be animal sacrifice. Usually, even the cattle which is grown for food, first you feed them well, make them healthy, and then the butcher takes them away and then you eat it. So similarly, the I can be made healthy with positive things. And a healthy I can transcend itself, but an unhealthy I cannot.
So what's the meaning of renunciation?
Means to let go.
So is it just letting go over like the I or of the actions or?
Well, letting go is primarily letting go of the I. But that I, because the I, all our actions and thoughts go through the I, because without the I it doesn't occur. And that's why letting go manifests externally. of letting go of likes and dislikes or this or that. But primarily, internally, it is the letting go of the hold of the I upon us. Yeah.
You said earlier in the beginning, speaking about the attachment to God, and that being a good thing. I kind of translate it as like a tool to be used. In the past, and even still, I have trouble reconciling, if one doesn't understand God, what God is, you really make a concept, and that concept comes from my translation of many things, my culture, my past experiences. And so now I'm sitting here, I'm worshiping a concept which I've created. Even if I use the same word as somebody else, it's still different concepts because I've created it for myself. And so is that attachment still a helpful tool, or is it detrimental, or is it something that's kind of like the best that you can, like God's never going to fit into a concept, so just
Yeah.
the best you can?
Yeah, good question, I think. Yeah, so attachment to God, not attachment to the concept of God or idea of God. So it's like this, surely when we pray, who do we pray to? Do we pray to an idea of God or God? So getting attached to the idea of God is a problem. But getting attached to God, I think, is not a problem. I mean, the idea is, just as I said, just as a healthy I will be able to transcend itself, if it's truly an attachment to God and to no one else, that attachment will melt away once I find God. So that attachment won't be an obstacle. That's what I'm saying. But an attachment to the idea of God, see, most people who quarrel about my religion is better than yours, or my God is the right God, your God is the wrong God, they are just fighting over concepts. Both are really, neither of them have seen God, neither of them have experienced God. It's just like, I'm clinging to my idea of God and I hate your idea of God. So basically that's what fights are. If both of these people had actually experienced God, then they would have realized, well, they are not two different beings, it's just one truth. So all quarrels and everything occurs from when neither of the party has seen the truth. Right? Yeah.
I'm having trouble distinguishing the difference between the idea and the actuality. Like when I'm walking around and I'm in the forest, God, the ocean, God, like giving up my actions, God, but when did like the sounds and the mantras and the words and the images and the statues, like how does that differentiate between like the actuality and like the idea?
All of those things are aids, are help. I mean, it's like when you call out to your friend. Well, your friend has a name, your friend has a form, and you call out your friend, but you're not like just making a sound, right? So when you're calling out to a friend and your friend comes, you're meaning a living being. But that living being is called out by a certain name. So when we chant a mantra, it's calling out to the divine. But the mantra, the name and the named, they are technically different, but they are one. It's not just like the name of your friend and the friend. You can't separate them out so easily. It's a little bit like that. Yeah.
So if I am not doing these actions, I'm not seeing, I'm not, not the big I. The little I is doing the seeing and the thinking, and so the big I is not doing the liking or disliking either. All the likes and dislikes are this body-mind thing. So I'm trying to figure out, it seems like, are we talking about two different paths, or maybe you can help me integrate these ideas that I can either separate myself from this body-mind thing and say, that's not me, I don't know what it is. I can separate myself from it, or I can try to purify it. So that seems like two different things to me. I'm trying to...
Well, purifying it, actually the two are connected. Unless and until you have purified it to some extent, you won't be able to separate yourself from it. So they go together.
Why can't I?
No. I mean, you can intellectually separate yourself from it. But doing it intellectually is not, I mean, that's only still an intellectual exercise. But actually, as you go about your day-to-day activities, to be able to actually experience it's not me, that won't be possible unless an amount of some purification has occurred.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does the concept of renunciation conflict with karma yoga?
Well, the concept of renunciation is not just one concept. If you're in karma yoga, really you are renouncing the fruits of action. You're renouncing your ego, you're trying to renounce your likes and dislikes. So there is renunciation involved in karma yoga also. Yeah. It's just letting go, and you are letting go. Karma yoga, you are letting go of the desire for the results. So there is renunciation involved there. Yeah. I think we will continue this discussion. We are just it's time now. So hold your questions. If you think you will not remember it by next Wednesday, just note it down. And if you wish, you can email me the questions, and then I can address them when we begin the class next Wednesday. All right? Om Jananim Saratam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhuhu. We bow down to Sri Ramakrishna and Holy Mother again and again. So next Wednesday, 7:30, we'll continue with the study of the 5th chapter. Our next big program will be on 17th August, so it's still about 3 weeks away. That will be the Krishna festival. But until then, we will continue with our Gita class. So we'll conclude with a prayer now. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the all-loving being become manifest unto us. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May the Divine bless us all and fill our hearts with infinite grace and love. Peace, peace, peace be unto